at Williams Road, all the animals are on.
We're on air.
You know, here in Briggle, we have past the old Kakana, you know, the first Kakana, and Crusher's been all the houses gone on.
Yes, I went out to Graham Road, somebody took me out taking it. I was surprised.
Yeah, it's amazing.
They're bigger,
Yeah, and then you go across to the Closest Road.
Yes.
That was, yeah, and that's all being built on. I think we get used to horses as it used to be. It's, I think it's different, isn't it? And you go down this main street, it's always used to be so.
It is now.
Yeah.
If you don't.
There are, but there still seems to be a lot of guns.
That's right.
If I heard anything about parking meters, I haven't heard anything. No. And that's I don't really have to go down the street and practice.
It is.
Yeah, all that money is in at the foot does.
Are you having problems with the sound system?
No,
Yeah,
no.
you see a lot of people.
And playing CDs and DVDs and,
I don't do any of that.
but you still go through that system, do you?
Yeah, just go through there. So they usually have,
it'd be
usually is,
It'd be interesting to find out because it kept going soft and loud. And when it was loud, it was dynamic sound. When it went soft, it was just so.
Okay.
Be interesting to
Harvey's
see
got
what
some
happens.
plans to play sound today, so we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens
Yeah.
if it goes through that system. I reckon it's
You're
a
going through that, aren't you, to play something today?
It's just a DVD.
DVD?
No, Harvey? Yes, well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
But if that happens, you'll know it's something wrong there.
we might need to get
If
something.
you're going through there, through that sound system, it might be different.
Oh, okay.
It depends. I don't know. You may,
Test it out.
going through that system, that'll come on.
Yes, that's on for the microphone. Yep, working.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll see what happens.
Okay, cool.
I always have a shower, but I first go to bed.
Yeah, that's the first thing. Then after I had the shower, I like to make me bed.
So you don't need the HDMI cord?
Oh, yes.
You don't need the HDMI cord?
Yeah, and
I don't think you need
All right, I'll unplug all that, put that back.
I did that when I worked, you know, I did that and I found dressing gown over the clothes and I'd be organised. Oh, yes, yes.
Oh, my time was sporting for days. I just wanted to
Come up and have a look at it.
I figured you're out there for
I do. I try to, but if I do want to, well, I have to part, and that makes it hard, doesn't it?
No, they're coming out.
And I tell you, we're Catholics, so
wasn't a big deal, just a everyday.
and I love through Tuesday in the month. But we used to like golf out.
You went from
Yes.
so sometimes it's
I sometimes She does. Yeah. And
My drag. She goes and puts on and went on the road. He said, well, it's like a song in the hour.
no, that's true. She,
We didn't get the.
and I don't think she really takes it, but I think these Christmas.
But she, you know, it's not right. I was so, you know, from the and you get on
Still waiting.
I always refer to you, Carol. I don't know.
Son is mine. Younger than mine. I said, well, I'll be a big man.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I started with this. That's the end of that. Oh, good. Anyway. Otherwise, I can't really go down and stay on.
No.
That's led to a line and on that street to the line. Because it's just it's open for me.
Oh, we're right on time, are we? Good morning. I'm filling in for Bob this morning because Bob's in hospital. So hopefully he'll get better soon. We've actually got a technical thing here on the table. The U3A bought a new webcam. So what we're doing with that is we're going to put some workshops live on the internet. So this one is actually going live right now. So you go live on YouTube. So that'll mainly focus on Harvey and not you. So if you see it swivel around, it's supposed to be an auto tracking thing, but I don't think it's working to track me at the moment. It's still focused on Harvey. So I may have not set it up right, so hopefully it'll work. Okay. Anyway, good morning and welcome Harvey. He's doing a talk on the disputed territory. Now that's about the 141st meridian.
Okay, well, yeah. That's what it's all about. But anyway, we don't have to get too much away yet.
Right. Keep it a surprise. Okay. I'll let you, I think everybody knows Harvey. I don't know Harvey, so Harvey might have to introduce himself.
Okay. Harvey Champness. Previously, Australian history and snapshots of history. She was at U3A many years. I retired twice. Bit louder, goodness.
Turn that one up.
That is the reason why it's not as,
Better?
it's just too much feedback. Is that okay?
Yeah.
A little bit of trouble getting this organised this morning. Yes, I tried retiring twice, so this isn't really returning for a third time. It's just a guest slot in Rhonda's local history program. Although I think she has suggested I do another one before then. That'll come up later. And just the way I've worked in the past, because this may not be the way local history is normally being done, I usually have a 5-10 minute coffee break around somewhere up around about 11 o'clock. Depends where you are. If it's up.
It depends on the other colour,
Okay.
if you look at it, I smaller than the other one.
See how we can. We did that for that. Okay, boy. Is that any better? Oh,
That's much
way better.
Way better.
Well, Pete, usually have a tea coffee break around about 11 o'clock, 5 or 10 minutes, just to break the session up a little bit. I think it's still all out there.
Yes, there's 10 copies out there. There's milk in the fridge. There's Vicky's in the top drawer.
Right, okay, it's good. And I guess I have to apologise a little bit, or two apologies actually, because my old history class have already had this session. So please bear with that. But I'm hoping you'll find a few differences, as well. So that's probably Carl and Nancy, I'm not sure. But anyway, hopefully it'll refresh the mind a little bit. And the other thing I've done is I've taken the definition of local history as the one. So if you're thinking, why isn't this about Horsham or something near Horsham? That is the reason. Because my expertise is not Horsham. It's the wider Wimmera. I think the topic of the disputed territory is one that you've either heard of vaguely or you'd like to know more about. And that's what I hope we can handle today. So to lead off, this isn't really a quiz, but it's to get you thinking about some of the anomalies that have happened in relation to the Victorian South Australian border. These are anomalies that affect us now. So does anyone remember the old school plastic map templates that you had in primary school? There used to be one of Australia and one of Victoria, if you were lucky. That was sort of wonderful when I got my plastic templates. Now, if we had those now, and I could not find what had happened to mine, has anyone got one stuck away in the drawer somewhere? No. The line that runs from right down through New South Wales through past Victoria to the coast is a straight line. And when we were kids, we wouldn't have even thought about that. And we wouldn't have thought that's wrong because we just assumed it was a straight line. And probably up to even 30 or 40 years ago, a lot of people still assumed it was a straight line, but it's not. So we'll skip down to this. Why is there a dog leg in the border between Victoria and South Australia when it meets the Murray River? And even up to just a few years ago, often when they showed you the weather map on the TV or whatever, you could not see that dogly. But you do now. So next time you look at the weather map, take notice of what happens when the border meets the Murray River. There's a couple of other things that come out of this as well. When should your mobile phone change its time from Victoria to South Australian time when you're driving to Adelaide or Watertown or wherever? When should it change?
At the border.
At the border. It doesn't. It actually changes slightly before the border. This is all leading to one thing, of course. And I don't want to get too technical with this, but I'll just have to explain this. You won't be able to see it too well, I'm afraid. This is a grid reference map for the border area that we're going to be particularly talking about today, around Silverstone and so on. This is the Western Highway here in red, the railway line coming through here, and here's Silverstone right here. So what this indicates, this is based on the geocentric datum of Australia. Does that mean anything to anyone? It was something that I used to use in one of the work programs I used to have years ago, because the datum is what you base northings and eastings on. They're not based on latitude and longitude. They're based on a grid pattern. And this grid pattern occurs right across Australia. But it is called the geocentric datum of Australia and was updated in the early 2000s, I think. So what happens is that you run along the bottom here, which is the eastings, and where it changes from 490 00 to 500 00. Where it's 500 00 is where the border actually should be. But it's not, it's back here, a little bit to the west. And if we don't need any more evidence, we have this question. Why was the Silverstone Railway Station actually built jointly by Victoria and South Australia governments? So we'll be answering that question as we go along, but I'm sure some of you know the answer already. So what does all this lead to? What does all this mean in terms of the border?
The border's not where we think it
The
is.
border's not where, well, it is where we think it is, but it's not where it should be, is the conclusion we have to draw. And some of these things you can follow up a little bit more at some point. For example, have a look at your mobile phone time change, etc. Okay, so the border is in the wrong place. And the question for us is, how on earth could this possibly have happened? So it goes right back to the mid-1800s for the answer to this. I'd like to refer to this now too, although it's sort of relevant to what we'll be doing later. To find it relevant because so 2 or 3 years ago, a group of historians and surveyors from Mildura actually went back up the Murray and rebuilt a can that had been set up on the Murray River, where the original survey line ended back in the early 1850s, I think it was. We'll come to that in a moment. Roughly the same time, right down on the coast, near Nelson, a group of historians and councillors and so on had rebuilt the old original Wade's mark. It was a starting point for the original survey. And then, again, about the same time, 2 or 3 years ago, a group of councillors and historians and so on from West Wimmera Shire and Taliara Council met north of Silverstone. It's actually a little bit north of Tilapia Dams, if you know where that is, where the original survey party stopped. And there's actually a marker there as well. So right up the border, you have these historic markers that indicate the original survey line, which of course was the wrong one. But it's still part of our history because it's still our border. So we'll explore a little bit how all that came about. So there's a few notes we'll use to work through. So just back. We use this to look for some of our discussion initially. There'll be here to move on. Okay. Yeah, but they're all the same. Now, some of this assumes a few things about your knowledge of history, although some of it's explained as well, of course. If we go right back to the first settlement in Sydney Cove, of course, you had a proclamation that covered, well, in theory, it probably covered the whole continent of Australia, but in actual fact, it probably only covered the eastern colonies. But all of that became New South Wales. Of course, later on, of course, New South Wales from Cape York to the southern coast was divvied up into Queensland, Victoria, below the Murray River, essentially. So where does South Australia fit into this? The colony was established in 1835. Does anybody remember what was different about the settlement of South Australia compared to the eastern states? There was one fundamental difference about
Something about arriving.
it was essentially the convict, non-convict issue. So South Australia never had convicts. It was settled as a free colony. So if you immigrated to South Australia, you knew you were entering a colony that didn't have convicts and had never had convicts. So South Australia was established in the Imperial Letters Patent in 1836, which established the border. And the border was set at 141 degrees meridian of longitude. So that was to be the border. And of course, this is where the problem started, of course. So the region between the coast and the Murray River was rapidly being settled by squatters, selecting large runs for sheep grazing. And possibly in some of your local history in previous years, you may have seen some of the early squatting maps. I'm sure there's probably some down in the Historical Society. And the thing about some of those early squatting ones is that they didn't take into account things like state borders and things like that. So some of the runs actually sort of more or less went over the border or over the border that should have been. But the region was being rapidly taken up by squatters with large runs that they, by that time, they actually had to pay for. Some of you will remember that some of the very early squatters in New South Wales just went and took up land and it just became theirs. Eventually, those squatters had to pay the licences and for the leasing of the land that they were used based on things like the number of stock they could run on their runs and so on. So some of them were pretty big, and some of those near the border would have been something like 100,000 acres. Certainly there would have been a few like that. But there was no clear border at this stage. So with no clear border, regular oversight was impossible. And none of this was being policed in any way. There were no land surveyors around to make sure that the squatting runs didn't impinge on one state or the other. They didn't really know where the border was anyway. So there was some urgency in defining an accurate border. So how was all this going to be achieved? How were they going to work out where the border actually was? The survey we'll have most to talk about is the Wade White surveys, but we'll deal with the Tyers survey first. So in 1839, Charles Tyers, an ex-Royal Navy gentleman, was instructed by Gipps, the New South Wales governor, to ascertain the precise longitude of the mouth of the Glenelg River, so that the distance to the 141st meridian would be measured. Do most of you have sort of a mental picture of what we were talking about along the coast? You'd be aware that the Glenelg River winds its way gradually to the coast. The Glenelg River starts in the Grampians, of course. But it winds its way to the coast and the mouth of the Glenelg River is at Nelson. Nelson, of course, is in Victoria. So for him, it was to try and work out where the 141st meridian would start on the coast. So Tyers completed a survey from Melbourne to the Glenelg River, set up a broad arrow with limestone rocks, a sort of cam marker, I suppose. And this became known as Tyers' mark. It was used as a starting point for the border survey. So Tyers' survey was really to find where should the border start and then go north to follow the 141st meridian. However, surveying equipment at the time was pretty basic, although I think it's fair to say that when you think of what surveyors had to use back in the days of the early settlement, it's pretty amazing how accurate they should get. There's all the early selections through the winter, for example. That includes bushing. They were just done with the old Lincoln chain method. You'd think, oh, too accurate, but it was pretty accurate actually. So they made very few mistakes. But Tyre's equipment probably was a bit inadequate, and he did not get it right. So it was determined later on, of course, when it was probably too late, that his mile was actually 2 miles and 4 chains, or it says here 3.3 kilometres. I think the figure is actually 6 in error. So that's where the problem started. So if Tyre's mark had been accurate, some of the later problems that have occurred would not have happened. And more people would have lived in South Australia as well. Not up to agriculture, but yeah. Okay, so what happened with the Wade White survey? This was a real drama of Australian history in some ways, how all this happened. So in 1846, the Colonial Secretary's Office directed surveyor Henry Wade to proceed from Sydney to the border to define a boundary for police purposes. Now, it didn't actually say initially that this was to be the state or the colonial boundary between South Australia and Victoria. But sometimes this was the terminology they used. And initially, a lot of the settlements that were set up out of Sydney, that was what they were for. They were boundaries for police purposes. So they were meant to be administrative boundaries. Of course, one of the things that the squatters got away with a little bit in New South Wales is that the squatting runs that they took up often just went way beyond the boundaries, which was fine. It meant that there was no real constraint on how much land they took up. But it also meant that they weren't under the jurisdiction of police, and they weren't under the protection of the police as well. So, they were living very much on the frontier. So in March 1847, Wade's party and equipment started at the mouth of the Glenelg River. He was joined by Assistant Surveyor Edward Watt, appointed by the South Australian government as an observer on its behalf. So there was no sort of conniving here. Victoria wasn't trying to steal a march on South Australia and set up a Victorian survey party. They did jointly want to try and make sure they got the border right, believing that the mark they were starting from on the coast near the Glenelg River was the 141st meridian starting point. Well, we know now, of course, that it wasn't. So White was representing the South Australian government, and as it turned out, he probably was a valuable contributor to the whole survey. And it was White who later actually completed the survey right up to the Murray River. But we'll come to that later. So after much deprivation and hardship, Wade was still 250 kilometres from the Murray River after 9 months of swamp, sand dunes and broken equipment. The expedition collapsed at the 36th parallel of latitude. So how many of you are aware of the countryside along the South Australian border looks like. Trying to envisage it from the coast right up through the little desert, the big desert, etc. Any thoughts on what it would have been like?
Rough.
It was pretty rough terrain in places, especially with sand dunes and so on in places.
Big areas when you go close from here, and like blue lines, sand.
They're essentially sand dunes, yes.
Huge.
This is a little bit of a digression, but from over in the southeast of South Australia, moving right up into the Wimmera, there are lines of sand dunes. Some aerial maps and so on actually show you this quite clearly. So here's a geological question. Why are they like that? I said this was a digression. We can't hear you.
Because the coastline changed over eons and eons.
Exactly. So as the sea receded, it left lines of sand dunes, lines of deposition, as it receded back towards where the coast is now. And it's also wide right through down through that area. There are large deposits of limestone as well on deposition of deposits from the sea. So, okay, but it was pretty rough country in places, in other places it would have been sort of open woodland, so it would have been much easier.
It's not much water.
But exactly, the further north you went, water became a problem. And there's only so much you can carry as well. So the 36th parallel, which probably worth trying to understand, and we can use this map book for this. Are you very familiar with the area north of Silverstone? Olympia Downs, all those places? Okay. So you'll have to use a bit of imagination here. So Tilapia Downs, which is here, which was opened up with the AMP land development scheme back in the 50s and 60s. So that's quite a bit north of the Western Highway and of Silverstone, of course. So this is a little bit of a punt because it hasn't actually got it on here, but I'm pretty sure the 36th parallel is about here. Not necessarily on that line, but it's about up here. So they did get some distance north of where the Western Highway is now, where the Wade and White survey party just stopped because they'd run into so many difficulties. They'd just about run out of water. The going was pretty hard because by the time we get up here, you're going right up into the big desert. So if you sort of got a rough idea where Murrieville is, That's that sort of marks roughly the break between the big desert. But then once you get past the big desert, you've got the basically valley wilderness. It runs nearly all the way up, not quite to the river, but a fair way up. So basically from the Western Highway north, you were traversing bush, rough bush country, lots of sand dunes, so it would have been hard going for horses and things like that.
The books that I read, they were saying that porcupine grass, you know, that really tough, spiky grass that grows within the winter, that would cut the horse's feet. So the horses suffered like that.
Yes, yes. And I mean, look, horses aren't necessarily all that suited to some sandy country anyway. That's what they had at the time. So I mentioned a moment ago that there were 3 markets right up along the survey line on the coast. So there was a market put on the coast, which has been redone just recently. There's the one right up on the river, which has also been redone. And there's one in between. And that one is at the 36th parallel mark to indicate where Wade's survey party that ran out of steam and stopped. They couldn't go on. So on the 16th of December 1847, the South Australian government issued a proclamation that the line as marked on the ground by Wade should be deemed and construed to be the eastern boundary of South Australia. In March 1849, New South Wales issued a similar proclamation. Now, I bet South Australia rued maybe that announcement because they were accepting the Wade survey, even though it hadn't been completed yet. They accepted the Wade survey line as the border of South Australia.
But even if it been completed, it still would have been that same line.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. It was just interesting though that they were prepared to make that proclamation before the border line was even completed by survey. So they 10, 15, 20 years later, they probably thought we've made a mistake here. Well, it wasn't too late in the sense that later on, of course, and we'll come to this shortly, they actually did take legal proceedings to try and reclaim the parts of South Australia that they lost. Ultimately, of course, that didn't work, but we'll come up shortly. So, as the survey was only partially completed, the 2 colonies agreed that Surveyor White should complete Wade's line to the Murray River as soon as possible. So, in August 1849, White began the extension from Wade's line, so from the 36th parallel, yes, north, and then continue right on to the Murray River. But his party was soon troubled by the severe nature of the big desert. In fact, that there was no surface water. It may have been water if you knew how to find it, but they didn't have the skills to do that. His men deserted him and 2 of his 3 horses died. White himself was on the verge of collapse, but survived by drinking some of the blood of his horse. Seems a bit gruesome, but I guess if you if you've got no alternative, you do anything, I guess. He managed to stagger onto the river. Now, I'm not exactly sure what point he had got to, but he would have been, I would have thought, pretty much up past the top of the middle desert, because then you have that line that runs through from Pinaroo, Murrayville, right across to Odeon. Is that sort of, if you can sort of imagine that? So that sort of breaks the big desert to the wilderness area further north. So then you sort of got to go into that as well. So I think you probably would have been into that final wilderness leg of the survey to and then make the dash to the river. Well, it couldn't have been a dash, but so he managed to stagger onto the river and complete the survey. After resting, he retrieved his saddle and bridle, crossed the river and borrowed a horse from Chawilla Ship Station. And I think there was something there where the Chawilla Ship Station is. I can't remember exactly what. And then he rode the 290 kilometres to Adelaide by his report. Any questions about that? So go or comment or
Just amazing that they got up there, but then had to turn around and come home with it.
yes, well, of course, for White being South Australian, if you look at a map, Adelaide's not actually all that far away. Have you done the drive from, say, Murrayville or even that road right up further north, the Sturt Highway that runs across from Mildura and then connects up with the main roads that go down into Adelaide. I did say you'd have to use a bit of imagination for some of these. It's a pity we just haven't got a map of the southeast of South Australia, of Australia, sorry, to look at. Make it a little bit easier. So we've been a lot further back to Melbourne or Sydney than Adelaide is much.
Closer, but still, how did they go for supplies? Getting back?
Well, there might have been some odd settlements, though.
Oh, okay.
Way back to Adelaide, so he wouldn't have been just rolling through totally empty country. I think. Okay, no questions so far. Okay, so we'll go over the page. There was a Smalley and Todd survey. So over time, doubts as to the accuracy of the way White line grew. It's a little unclear how those doubts started to arise, whether there was some concern about the original survey anyway, the given conditions under which it was conducted. Actually, it might have been a little bit out. And of course, what they eventually did find was that the original survey marker on the coast was in the wrong place. And that was the beginning of all their problems anyway. So by agreement, an expedition left Adelaide in April 1868 for Chawilla near the Murray River and the border. It was led by George Smalley, New South Wales Government astronomer, and Charles Todd, South Australian Superintendent of Telegraphs. You might think that's a rather odd combination, but those sort of people at the time would have had a wide range of skills in terms of surveying and being able to use what was available to them, the equipment that was available to determine, well, obviously latitude and longitude, and where they actually were. The purpose was to make transit observations, so using the stars, if you could, At the same time, from the observations were made in Melbourne. And then they could sort of correlate the findings and see how they match up. So as a result of their observations, they declared the new 141st meridian led to the discovery that the decline border on the ground was at least 2 miles and 19 chains, so roughly 3.6 kilometres, to the west of where it should be. Thus, the dilemma of the disputed territory began, a bone of contention for many years. So, we saw it on these maps, of course. I ran out of green. I was actually going to do a map on the board just to demonstrate. You've got this sliver of territory running from the Murray River right down to the coast. That should have been the other way. So Victoria would have had west land and South Australia would have had north. But this illustrates it here, of course. So, and as I said, using the grid references, and you could do the latitude and longitude as well, because this grid reference, the 500 represents the 141st meridian. That's where it actually is. So you've got this sliver of land running from the coast to the border, to the Murray River, so all of which South Australia later realised about and lost. So what did that amount to in land terms? So it contained over 500 square miles or 1,295 square kilometres of land. I wasn't going to do a conversion to acres or hectares to get around to that, but it would be enormous. It doesn't look much, 3.6 kilometres, to translate that for the whole distance. And that's how much territory South Australia lost to Victoria. And by 1849, 47% of it had already been sold or leased out by New South Wales. That probably sounds a bit odd. Why New South Wales, why not Victoria? Has anybody picked the... Victoria didn't exist. Exactly. Victoria didn't exist till 1851. So it was actually still New South Wales at that time. Okay, so you can imagine the legal disputes and so on that arose from that. But I'm not sure how thirsty you feel. This is probably a good time to break for a 10-minute, a little bit early. But I'm just trying to sort of make our time work this morning. So after we come back from a couple, I'm going to show you a short DVD or short video, which I've only done 2 or 3 years ago, which is about the whole disputed territory issue. You'll have to be a little bit, what's the word, accepting of the way it's presented. And you might even not be sure about some of the things that it says. Yeah, that's why some things are presented these days. And there's 1 or 2 other things we'll look at as well. And then we'll come back to looking at how it all panned out in the finish. I believe that Tony Puckett is still just out in the door there.
There's stuff under the bench too.
Okay, yeah. But the water is there.
But the water's
The
out.
water's there, yeah. Okay, let's start. So about 10 minutes and then we'll reconvene and go from there. Yeah, right. Interesting. Sorry. If you know the live stream, it was a break.
I'll just put in the chat that we're having to have coffee break and we'll resume at 11. We've had 2 people join and drop out again, so it's interesting.
They couldn't be something about our history class. He said, "Oh, I've seen this before."
You in South Australia, Victoria.
Keep going.
That's a worry.
I didn't know we could get the phone,
So far.
How about you?
You do have.
Two farms and not any much around to the west. Yeah, so we. And the bowling green, trying to go in the middle of the
That's a good one. So that's the one.
Actually, Jane Bosch, and then what's real, her property goes way through, goes 2002 units. I just don't get the
And June motion.
change the price round.
Yes, it
It goes across over 2 units. I left around there yeah, at the night before.
I know, yes,
But it
yeah.
goes back to friends, and they went back to bed.
They've got that fence up there. It's like the fence they have a fence across the street. Now it goes down to the second way. There's still a big one. There was a chap there on you know. Friends of Trump Yes, when I was out with my son, the boy was 6 houses, and then now that's yeah, the road goes in, does it connect with birds? That's the generation. And this, the 6 house come over here, there's 6 ordinances. And they all play Saturday night walk.
Back up. And when it was 1 degree on each side of the I just take all the front yards. It's amazing when something comes in what happens Yes, and then you went in the dining room,
Did you feel that?
No, no. She said,
Tried to. They seems to think that they have been going through tourist and the other week it was so windy. But must have some fence on the
it's taken over. No,
I was up there one night
when he got
she didn't let her, she went straight home. And she said she bought. Yeah, and I said she should, I said, and Lois, and then, that's why it's Friday, she had the passion up for it, then Monday, I said, have the tax. Yeah. Oh, yeah. See, obviously, it's all and then they got more to be so well, but you can't the moment. But she's really hard for this. So there's a lot of activity but I've got a bit this race is like she was totally
Well, I'm trying to do. But I get funny thing. It is.
Two months ago, and that was also effective.
The paper was. And that's the reason. Otherwise, it was.
We finished now?
I just want to introduce
Yes.
this, one day I mentioned that volume on this. But this will speak for itself. It was actually a DVD that was put together, a sort of a know your history.
Mark switched on?
No, I've gone.
Mark's still on.
No, I've turned it off for the moment.
We can't hear
Okay.
you. You know, I'm gonna change.
Danielle.
Let's just get it. Okay,
Okay, cool.
Wow.
this is the problem. We're just having so much problem getting the levels right.
That's good. That's good.
So, but all I want to do was to introduce this DVD, which was put together as sort of one of those easy history series, but it is interesting to see what they presented. And there's a couple of music insights in it as well. Okay, thanks, go.
Long dispute. I knew I had to go and find out more. Now, for most of my life, I definitely thought that this was a straight line. But no, as you can see here on Google Maps, this beautiful straight border that connects South Australia with Queensland and New South Wales suddenly hit the state of Victoria jumps west. Distance around 3.5 kilometres. So I wanted to find out, number one, how did this happen in the first place? Number two, what happened to all the residents in the town in this disputed area? And number three, what the hell is going on with this river water? So here's the history. The British made their claim on Australia and started forming colonies. There was the convict colony of New South Wales, which would later split into New South Wales and Victoria, and the freely settled area of South Australia. And it was decided that the border separating SA and New South Wales would be set at 141 degrees. And so this could actually be used by farmers. The colonists needed to work out exactly where the border was. They needed to find this border. And this had never been done before. In fact, this would be the first surveyed border in the country. And the man for the job was Irish-born Henry Wade, who was a trained surveyor with great facial hair, and his protege, Edward White. Now, he was an emerging surveyor. In fact, he got in trouble in his youth and was arrested for being drunk and vandalising a pedestrian bridge. Now, in their first attempt in 1847, they started at the coast, using pretty basic surveying equipment and making their way north. Now, across this whole way, they didn't have survey markers, so we marked the boundary every so often with piles of rocks and burning the trees on each side of the border. And this was extreme work in the hot outback sun. At one stage, his team almost died of thirst while he pushed north on a horse that itself died of dehydration. And White was in such a poor state that he drank the blood of his horse just to make it to the river. But by 1850, after multiple trips, they'd done it, completing the survey and defining the border from the coast to the River Murray. So while this was an incredible achievement, the line was drawn around 3.35 kilometres off in the north and 2.96 kilometres in the south, an area lost by South Australia to Victoria. Now, this mistake was discovered in 1868, when using new telegraph technology, they could take accurate timing measurements. So we had a stalemate, with the governments aware of the issue, but neither backing down. And they had to work together on a project, and this is where things get interesting. It gets more real and involved me taking a multi-hour road trip. So to understand this better, I decided to head into the heart of this territory. It's about 5 hours from Melbourne to the border, and the epicenter of this drama, an unused railway station. I'm at the historic railway station in Surbiton, a small town in the Australian state of Victoria. But the fact is that I shouldn't be. This entire area only exists in this state due to a surveying error made over 100 years ago. In the late 1800s, as South Australia and Victoria grew in size, there was a need to connect these colonies, and the solution was a railway line. They needed a place for customs to change railway gauges, so while this area was still in dispute, it was agreed that South Australia and Victoria would both pay for this station. I met with Les, a Surbiton resident and custodian, who told me more about the story, and he showed me this incredible historic site, the kitchens, the waiting rooms, customs, and even the holding cells. These days, there's not much in Surbiton. It was population 120 at the last census, there's a camping area, and a general store that doubles as the post office. And just to explain the rivalry at the time, the story goes that the SA Premier thought that the station and town should be named after him and wrote to the Victorian Premier suggesting that. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The name? Surbiton. The Victorian Premier's name at the time, James Service. So while I was in town, I went and found the current border as well as where things could have been. I've taken the back road of Surbiton with the GPS to try to find exactly where the border would have been. And this is a line of 141 degrees. So while this station did an important job, it didn't resolve the issue. So what do you do if neither state is willing to concede? The South Australia prepared an invasion. The SA government announced that they would be sending in surveyors to subdivide the land. Victoria responded by saying they would be treated as trespassers and arrested. The SA government thought this wasn't a great idea and they backed down on the plan. Instead, this would be fought in the High Court of Australia, which was made up of the first Prime Minister of Australia, 2 beards and 2 moustaches. And their ruling was from Victoria, saying that the people did the best they could with the best technology of the time and in good faith. You couldn't update a border every time the technology improved. One moustache dissented, saying that the Act said that the border was at 141 degrees and no one else could change that. The case was then appealed and sent to the Privy Council in the UK, who made the final ruling, agreeing with the High Court of Australia and giving the land to Victoria. So on the 28th of January 1914, after 64 years of doubt, the issue was finally resolved. Except for that whole river border thing. I'll get to that. I think this could have been a historical oddity where after 1901, when the country federated, the idea of state borders pretty much went away. Now that was until 2020, when due to the coronavirus, the states closed, and this became a hard border. This really impacted the people living in Surbiton and the surrounding area. They needed to do things like go through military and police checkpoints, undertake regular coronavirus tests, and get permits for travel.
It's been a struggle to try and get across to go and help and do the things that you need to do as a carer.
It's a temporary place where the guards were set up, the police and the Defence Force, who were doing the stops for the coronavirus check. So this was again one of the back roads. The main highway was that way. But yeah, everyone had to get stopped and checked into the computers on the way through. I'm originally from South Australia, but now I live in Victoria. So I don't really have a dog in this fight. Maybe I've got 2 dogs. But West End Brewery does. They're a proudly South Australian beer. They ran a campaign all about reclaiming this territory that would say,
And I think 4 or 5 cartons of West End Beyond, we don't drink it. So we used to give it away, probably.
I'm not sure it worked. All the people I spoke to in service said look pretty happy being Victorian. But now for that river border. So here's a simplified, very much not to scale map showing how the state borders connect. We have New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria, and 11 kilometres of the Murray River. Now, most river borders in the world are defined to be in the centre of the river. And since the Victorian Constitution Act of 1855, it was agreed that the entirety of the river was in New South Wales, with the border being the southern bank. So that defines this border. And thanks to the Privy Council and the other border being predefined, we know these 2 points. But what happens in between just isn't clear. Now, one option would be that New South Wales, as they claim the Murray River, would have rights to all of this area. Now, another option is per normal border rules, where Victoria would claim this part. Now, making it interestingly the only part of the Murray River in the state. And this is what Google Maps goes with. Or maybe South Australia controls this whole River Murray area. And supposedly that's what happens on the ground, with state fisheries patrolling this part of the river. So which of these is correct? Well, it's a legal grey zone, so it's not entirely clear. But if you do travel here, if you do get arrested on the river, do let me know which police officers arrested you. Thanks for watching this story. It was really fun to explore. Now, I've made previous videos about both Victoria and South Australia, so feel free to choose a side and dive into them. I'm Julian O'Shea. Catch you next week.
People of Surbiton rejoice, you're actually South Australian, not Victorian. Surbiton is a South Australian town.
Just going to see if I can change it to another file. Sure, how I can but a file is just yeah. There's nothing in there. Okay, so this. Yes, up to you. So I'm just going to for a quick look, a few photos of Serviceton. Just to sort of give some sort of reference, I suppose. The general store. Don't think it operates there. The railway station, which is an incredible building and is well worth a look. It looks a little inconsequential from the line side. The picture was taken on the southern side. Gives you an idea of the sheer size of the station. That was the original reservoir for the trains. But that's actually in South Australia. Even now, it's in South Australia. That's the border, of course, where the COVID checkpoint was set up. And just west of that point on the highway is where the first meridian actually is. Okay, it's just repeating now. So. Thanks, Trish. Just get out of it. Oh, okay. Dramatic way of doing it. Okay, you probably have noticed that the script that went with the video, it left a lot out. And there's plenty of things we've discussed and just wouldn't even mention that. And one example was the fact that the survey was done in two parts. First of all, was the white and white survey, and white completed, etc. But anyway, it gave you the general picture of what's happened, how it happened, and how things have happened since. Personally, I think West End's attempt at promoting the beer through Serviceton was a pretty shameful attempt, but anyway, that's just my opinion. And apparently, as Les, the guide at the station, said, most Serviceton people just weren't even interested. They were probably bemused, though, by all these TV cameras coming in from Adelaide and making a program out of Serviceton. So it provided a bit of excitement for a while. So anything else in the video that you noticed that was said or unsaid?
They said that South Australia patrols that portion of the Murray. I said. He was confused. Who did what? If you ever get arrested, he wants to know. Yes, police arrested you. Yes.
Whether that would clarify the issue, and I don't think it does, actually. But it's a very good point, and look, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I would have thought in that little part of the Murray, it's 11 kilometres of river, even though it's only 3.6k as a crow flies. You know, how rivers wind and all that sort of thing. So you understand the New South Wales Victoria, don't you? Victoria just agreed that the whole of the Murray was New South Wales. But that doesn't apply to that little bit there. And I would have thought that in just that bit, Victoria actually controlled half of the river in South Australia, the other half. I would have thought that would be a reasonable interpretation, but he was throwing all sorts of doubts on that. So there's a bit of research for somebody. Okay. So we'll pick up where we were. The legal disputes. South Australia did not let them at rest. In 1874, it suggested the value of the land was £800,000. Between 1883, that's a huge amount of money back then, of course. Between 1883 and 1893, South Australia sent more than 70 letters to Melbourne seeking Victorian relinquishment or financial redress. Relinquishment meaning they hand over the territory to South Australia. Now that wasn't going to happen. Or financial redress. A number of conferences were held to come to some agreement without success. In 1908, it was decided, subject to ratification by Parliament, that £215,000 should be regarded as compensation to South Australia. That sounds a fair bit lighter on to 800,000. And I'm not sure what the current value would actually be, but it would still be very low. But Parliament did not ratify the proposal. There was the South Australian Premier's plan to send surveyors to subdivide some of the land on the east of White's marked border. So this was what the video said was South Australia's plan to send surveyors in and basically survey the land and sell it as part of South Australia. That was their plan. But this did not go ahead, and of course would have been hugely problematic anyway. South Australia finally abandoned all hope of settlement, and in 1911 it appealed to the High Court only to have the appeal dismissed, and that was discussed on the video. In 1914, now it said 1913 there, but it was only actually ratified in 1914. It appealed to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which ruled in favour of Victoria. Now, we've probably forgotten about some of this. It wasn't all that many years ago that you had a last legal resort in Australia if you didn't agree with the High Court. You could take it to the Privy Council in London. But of course, things have dramatically changed since then, and you know the High Court is the last or the highest court in the land. There were some suggestions on the video, but what do you think would have led both the High Court and the Privy Council to rule in favour of Victoria?
Possession is the laws.
What's the saying? Possession is 9/10 of the law, or something like that. And that's probably true to a fair degree.
But the other argument was you can't redefine the border when you get better equipment.
Yes, yeah, that was an argument used on the video as well. I guess you would hope that once they have finally decided what the 141st meridian was, that they'd be pretty content with that. And nothing's changed in relation to that. They know where that meridian of longitude is. But the fact remains is that whatever circumstance comes up, you can't keep changing something. And of course, just the implications in terms of, people who have bought land in what they think is Victoria or whatever. Sorry, you were going to say.
No, I'm agreeing with what you're saying.
Right, yeah. You just wonder how they would ever have done it, really. Because you're talking about this slice of land, even though some of the land north of the Western Highway is barely usable from an agricultural or pastoral point of view, it is still land, it's still to be possessed, I guess. The only places where, as we've seen in more recent years, the only places where it wouldn't have been an issue would have been in the Big Desert National Park and in the wilderness area further north, because essentially that's green land, so it wouldn't make so much of a problem. But everywhere else, the land has already been alienated, it's already been sold and bought by pastoralists or farmers or whatever. And it would just be a legal, logistical nightmare to try and do it. But by the time we got to the 20th century. So South Australia finally gave up after that. Despite the best attempts at West End, but I think we accepted that was just a promotional thing. So, okay, so Silverstone itself. So this is the one town that has been most impacted by this dispute. So it began as a railway town and continued as such until 1986. But before that, of course, and the video referred to the fact that it was part of the connection of the Victorian and South Australian main lines between Melbourne and Adelaide. And one, it's not exactly a myth, but one belief that needs to be put to bed immediately is that there was not a gauge change between Victoria and South Australia. Some people say that, and that was the reason why they changed trains at Silverstone. It's not the reason at all. So they used the old wide gauge 5'3", I think it was in the old terminology. That went from Melbourne to Adelaide. So that wasn't the issue. I'm sure some of you would remember though the Melbourne-Sydney line. Yeah. You had to change it already because you went from a 5'3" line to 4'8.5" or whatever in New South Wales, or what we call the narrow gauge. And of course, ironically, we have an historical development in our time that the line from Adelaide through to Ararat, or is it Ballarat, is narrow gauge because it was all converted. And that's why you have to go down through Geelong on the overland to follow the narrow gauge, because the line from Ballarat to Melbourne, and this is an anomaly I do not understand, is still wide gauge. So, and that's why you only get passenger trains on the Ballarat to Melbourne line. You don't get any goods trains at all on that line there. But the narrow gauge turns and goes to Geelong and then back to Geelong. It's Ararat. So yes, I wasn't sure. Yeah.
Is that why they're having problems bringing the train services back?
Look, it probably is to a degree, and it shows it.
This is the
It shows a level of short-sightedness.
Adelaide to Ararat and then down to Geelong.
Yeah. But I thought that Melbourne Pine covers some days as far as Ararat.
It does.
Yes, it does.
Yes.
But that's wide gauge, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
why we have to.
Yeah.
But didn't they work on this gauge some years ago and changed it?
Yes, I did. Yes, all the way to Ararat, from Adelaide to Ararat. I guess we would ask the question, why, when they made the decision to standardise the line, didn't they just standardise the lot? Because it just would have made it so much easier. But too much things. I guess the cost was a factor amongst other things. So, but anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that there was, because of what happened with Albury, where you actually, and by the way, that's now standing gauge all the way from Melbourne to Sydney. There's no change. But you used to have to actually change trains at Albury when you were going to Sydney, or back the other way. That wasn't the case for Silverstone. So the reason why you had train changes, and essentially it was really only the change of engine rather than a whole train having to be changed. And that was part of, that was a throw over from this dispute as well. So the railway station was built in 1887. So I'll go back. It was named after James Service, mentioned on the video. The station was built in 1887 and operated from 1889 in the disputed territory, with both state governments contributing half the cost. There was a changeover point for Victorian South Australian locomotives and crews, and also served as a customs post. So we're talking about the second half of the 1800s, when there were customs posts both on roughly where the highway is. There was a customs post there, and at Silverstone railway station as well. And somehow, you might know more about this than me, it's connected with the customs post as you drive into Adelaide as well. You know the one I meant? You're driving down through the Mount Lofty ranges, through the tunnel, and then just before you hit the first major intersection, there is a little customs post. It's still sitting there, right in the middle of the road. Okay, so customs posts, a holding place for interstate prisoners. So the Silverstone railway station had, well, we can call it a dungeon for want of a better word. It had cells underneath the station for interstate prisoners. That wouldn't be with necessarily with passenger trains, but quite possibly all the same. And it had substantial refreshment rooms as well.
How did that be the connection with the police, the purpose of the border originally? They were talking about police jurisdiction.
Yes, it probably was something to do with that. Yeah. So the prisoners would leave the trains and then they would be held in the cells underneath the station overnight or for however long it was required. Is there anyone here who happened to do the steampunk train ride to Silverstone? Well, that happened, but I hadn't talked to anybody who did it. But it was a real hit, apparently. Because as part of the rule of steampunk, they arranged a train ride to Silverstone, and they when they got there, you got this lavish lunch and in the refreshment room, which is still serviceable, which is alone. The poor old Silverstone people who used to do catering there at the station just couldn't give up. They just ran out of personnel, which something we know a lot about.
I thought it was just a shuttle service from Horsham to Dinbula. That's
For,
one thing.
this is just this year. It was a once off.
Yeah.
But no, it did go to service.
No, I didn't know. I just saw it sort of here.
Yeah, I didn't see it. I haven't met anyone who did it.
There's stuff in bow ties.
Yes. I've always wanted to do an historical train tour, and I haven't done it yet. So, but anyway, it was a huge success apparently. But the refreshment rooms were, all of this is still there, by the way, and it is possible to get a guided tour of the station. You'd have to make arrangements, of course. But it's well worth looking at. And the refreshment rooms probably weren't all that less substantial than Ballarat Station. So that gives you another view of how big that actually were, because at one stage, we're thinking, back into the very late 1800s and early 1900s, when the trains, so for argument's sake, the train was coming from Melbourne heading to Adelaide and stopped in Surbiton. So they had a refreshment time because they had to change the locomotives over. So it became a South Australian locomotive rather than a Victorian one to take the train for the rest of the journey to Adelaide. And of course, the same thing coming the other way.
Didn't they have to change the carriages as well? I mean, that'd be a different gauge.
No, they were all the same gauge.
Really?
The gauge was the same. Yes.
I can't visualise that. I know the rolling stock with that, we did one as well.
No. They all they had to do was change the locomotive.
Yeah.
And that was because of this demarcation between Victoria and South Australia. Because the South Australians weren't going to have the train pulled by Victorian locomotives into South Australia. However, there was another very good reason why they changed it to South Australian locomotives. You're not allowed to tell them, right?
If you took a train crew from Adelaide, like they'd be gone all day when they get back again. Like they go. They are allowed to sleep. Yeah.
A good question though, we'll come to that in just a moment. Any thoughts? And I actually didn't realise this just a few years ago. The Adelaide locomotives were more powerful. And the reason was that they had to pull the train up through the Adelaide Hills. It was just a really practical reason. But they would have done it anyway, because the two railway systems were still essentially separate, although they did do a lot of stuff jointly all the same.
I was going to say it wasn't go there, but there was a turntable to
Yes.
servicing. So when the engine came from Adelaide, it could be turned around and faced back in.
Yes, yeah. And it served both,
Yes.
the locomotives from both ends, of course. So they did need a turntable to turn the locomotives around. So that when the train came back from Adelaide, they just put a Victorian locomotive on it.
So they would have had to have storage for both Victorian and South Australian engines that serviced them.
When you say storage, there would have been sidelines to keep a few of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wouldn't have. They would have had to have a couple there just to ensure that everything would be okay. But the other part of that was that they had. So they used South Australian crews for the Adelaide part of it and Victorian crews and Victorian part of it, obviously. So they housed both crews in Surbiton. And then to top it off, South Australia also had crews who lived in Wolseley, which is just about 8 or 10 k's along the road along the railway, actually, into South Australia. And that was why Surbiton became a railway town. So 2/3 of the houses in Surbiton were the old, what we would call housing commission homes. This wouldn't have been right at the start, of course, but these are the ones that represented the housing commission homes that were built during the 40s and 50s. And when they stopped, the Surbiton station was closed down in 1986, I think. It's probably here. They sold off all the houses in Surbiton, or all the railway houses in Surbiton, I should say. Some are still there, people bought them. Some just got picked up and carted off somewhere else, somebody's house. I mean, the story of the cruise line, you could write a book about it, but I'll leave that to somebody else. Tackle that one. Okay. Due to the lack of water for locomotives, so your early locomotives, of course, were steam locomotives, probably right through to the 40s or early 50s, I would suggest. The reservoir was built outside the town, astride the borderline between Victoria and South Australia. I should review my notes because I don't think that's actually true. But where it was actually in South Australia. Because one of those pictures you saw was the old reservoir, and you can still see that today. But they did need water, and this was later replaced by a more substantial reservoir north of the Western Highway, which you can still go in and see today. I think it's actually marked on the highway. But that would have been in South Australia if they got the survey right. But the town is currently served by underground water. The town developed quickly in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And while many of the initial services had fallen away by the 1950s, it still had a substantial population. So even when I was teaching in Canada in the late 70s, there were still 2 busloads of school kids who came from Surbiton to school in Canada. So there was still a fair population. And we're talking about the late 1970s, so the station is still operating. You still need all the crews, you still need the station yard staff. There's a term for it, I can't think of it. So it's still a reasonable population there in the 1950s and 60s and 70s.
My brother was employed by Victorian College, probably the early 60s, and he was stationed there.
Yeah.
And there was accommodation for him and all the other young men.
Yes. So the permanent Surbiton station staff would live in the houses, but they also had barracks for itinerant crew, so train drivers and conductors and all that sort of things. And they would just stay in these barracks, which would be intended for anyone who needed a bed while they were staying over. But they didn't allocate houses for those people. That would be for more permanent people.
To go like in the Oval, would have been early 50s. Steam trains or
Very good question. I'm not exactly sure when the changeover occurred, but it just might have been moving into the diesel era by then.
The Adelaide station to come home, there was always two engines on there. And I don't know whether it was Meriian, they don't look one, and when you move down the Meriian, they look one, another one on.
Yes.
It was all the map of them.
Yeah, look, I'm sure you're right. Once they got over the Mount Lofty ranges, we wouldn't need the two big engines, so they just took them off. You know, I'm sure that happened. Yeah.
I think that they are carriages or anything.
No.
They just went straight through.
Well,
Yeah.
okay. Public hall was built by Victorian Railways, so the main hall in the town was the old VRI hall. Victorian Railways Institute, is it? Ring a bell. And lots of towns that featured with railways had halls built by Victorian Railways. So with the closing of the station in 1986, the town declined rapidly, and many of the old Victorian Railway residences were sold off. So apart from the station, which has a heritage classification, there remains only a general store, which I think is currently closed. One church, which is now not even in the town. It's actually up at the recreation reserve. A bowling club, which is very active. And
It's got a good bowling.
yes. And a recreation reserve where there is an oval, the old footy club rooms, I suppose you'd call them, which are pretty good. And that's where actually the one church is located now. And they set up a small caravan park near the recreation reserve facilities with power and had facilities there and so on, which is amazingly used quite often. And the I don't think the charge for overnighting their caravan park is very substantial. So would probably be the cheapest caravan spot in the whole of Australia. No, perhaps not. But, this is a bit of an aside, but back during COVID, when you had what were called border refugees, people who thought they were going to get into South Australia suddenly discovered they couldn't. Some of them just camped at the Silverstone Rec Reserve, and apparently it was full for quite a bit of that early period of COVID. The Silverstone camping ground was full all the time. Yeah, think about it. And you, in those on the video, you saw the South Australian Police operating the border crossing during COVID as well. So this is another aside. Ray and I actually came up against that little shed you saw on that back road. We did have permits.
We did get through.
We did get through. So a hot day, a tiny little portable beside the road, which must have been terrible, and one policeman. So they inspected that. He inspected our documents.
You going to mention the no pump thing?
Sorry,
Remember you saying years ago that neither state, because while that territory was in dispute,
yes,
neither Victoria or South Australia had built a pump.
yes, that's correct.
All the afternoon tea football clubs and cricket and stuff used to be afternoon tea at the railway station. So
Yes, because they have a license at the station.
oh,
So you couldn't drink at the station.
Ah.
Yes. Why not use what's there? I'm feeling I might have missed a couple of things here, but are there any questions? Yeah, this kind of sharing. I think it's a fascinating topic, and just the way it came about is quite, even historically, it's quite unusual. It's, yeah, it makes a good story. And I have no interest, no pecuniary interest in this. It is worth a visit to Silverstone to have a look at the station. And if you tie up a bit of a guide, going to something like that. Okay, so if there's no further questions, perhaps we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, Harvey, very much. That was interesting. I wouldn't mind taking going for a drive to have a look. Now Rhonda's left a little present here for you. Thank you very much for today.
It's gracious. Thank you.
Next week, we're hoping that Bob will be back. Next local history is on Monday, July 28th. And it will be Wendy Donald from the Horsham Historical Society. And she's going to be talking about the Wimmera-based hospital from its early days until the 21st century. And after her, we've got June Liddy, who started the goat farm, Sylvania Park, just out of town. So she's going to be talking about what her life has been like as a business person and a farmer in the Wimmera. So everyone's welcome. Thank you very much, again, Harvey, for that. That was great.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah. And thanks, Trish, for looking after me.
So what?
Yeah. Yeah.